The story is told of the Smith family, who was very proud of the fact that ancestors had come to America on Mayflower. As a legacy for their children, they hired a top-notch author to research and write a book about their family history. Much to their horror, it was discovered that great-uncle Clarence had been executed in the electric chair for committing murder. Devastated, they didn't want this embarrassment to be revealed as part of the book, but they felt that they didn't want great-uncle Clarence to be omitted either. After voicing their concerns to the author assured the family that he could handle everything tactfully. When the book came out, the section on great-uncle Clarence read, "Great-uncle Clarence occupied a chair of applied electronics at an important government institution. He was attached to his position by the strongest of ties, but his death came as a great shock." We know inheritance matters. Some of you might even know exactly how much your children or grandchildren are to receive. But legacy matters more. Are you as familiar with the legacy you're leaving them as you are with the inheritance you're bequeathing them? Whether you have kids or you don't, do you know what legacy you will leave behind? First and foremost, we leave our family a precious legacy as Jews. Scholar Thomas Cahill, in his book, The Gift of the Jews, reveals to the world the Jews started it all. So many of the things we care about, the underlying values that make all of us, Jew and Gentile, believer and atheist, tick. But while it's easy to pat ourselves on the back, the legacy we inherit as Jews is not entirely rosy. In fact, our Torah portion this morning, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. Jewish tradition reminds us that we are the inheritors of a legacy seemingly complicated by faith, imbued with fear. In this morning's parasha, God instructs Abraham to take his son Isaac and to offer Isaac as a sacrifice to God. Abraham, the man who argued with God regarding Sodom and Gomorrah, says nothing in response to God's request. For 3 days they walked together, father and son, with Isaac beseeching his father for information on their destination. Each time Abraham tells Isaac, trust in God. Finally, coming to what is today Jerusalem's Temple Mount, Abraham binds his son Isaac upon a rock so that Isaac will not move. Who will save this child? The reader wants to call out. Who will save this child from the hands of his father? Abraham lifts his knife, and just when he's about to strike, an angel of God calls out to Abraham and tells him to stop. God then tells Abraham, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you obey me. Excuse me. In our Torah portion this morning, God concretizes the covenant with Abraham because God sees the extent to which our patriarch is willing to go in the name of faith. Certainly, thousands of years later, we are the inheritors. This covenant, God and Abraham. But the moment which Abraham steps as hell, that has been passed down through the nations. The Brit is our inheritance, establishing that if we follow the mitzvot, God will give us the land of Israel. In addition, God will allow us to prosper, and God will relate to us as a chosen people. That is the inheritance. But what is the legacy? A certain man, Chaim, was speaking to his friend Shmuley over coffee one morning. Oi, sighed Chaim, I desperately need a job. Why don't you work for your mother, Shmuley suggested. She'd be a great boss. Go work for your mother. Chaim shook his head. I can't, he said. Her company has a very strict policy against hiring relatives. Who made up that ridiculous rule? Asked Shmuley. My mother, Chaim replied. The Torah reveals that following the binding, Abraham and Isaac cut off all conversation, as if the knife originally meant for Isaac severed not the boy himself, but the father-son relationship instead. It's tough to have a cold on Rosh Hashanah. Later in the Torah, we come to find out that Isaac and his son Jacob ceased to communicate as well. A legacy of familial dysfunction passed from one generation to the next. For some of us here, our relationship with our parents or with our children, or even with our siblings, is at best strained, and for others, their relationship is non-existent. Yet our children are watching and learning. We demonstrate for our children how we expect them to treat their siblings by how we treat ours. We model for our kids how we want them to care for us by showing them how we care for and treat our own parents. Might you, in the name of Rosh Hashanah, seek to forgive family that has wronged you? Might you, in the name of your legacy and your own mental health, choose to let go of wrongs committed? Lifanim misharat hadin, the Talmud tells us, one need not be asked for forgiveness in order to forgive. While the pshat, or plain meaning of our Torah text, suggests a strained parent-child relationship, the midrashic interpretation of the binding of Isaac, the way the rabbis read the text, seeks to flip the plain meaning of the Torah on its head. First and foremost, Abraham comes across in the midrash as a loving father desperate to spare Isaac from God's request. Which son? Abraham asks of God. Isaac? No, surely you don't mean him. You must mean someone else. The rabbis too teach that Abraham, who had argued with God earlier to protect the innocence of Sodom and Gomorrah, knew that our fair and just God would never allow him to go through with the sacrifice of Isaac. Abraham followed God's request, the rabbis explain, only because he knew God would stop him before the deed was done. Abraham's legacy is one of faith coupled with reason and justice. And that is the kind of faith Abraham passes on to the next generation. In the Midrash, Isaac too comes across very different. Rather than a young child suffering at the hands of his father, Isaac is a grown man making a choice. When Abraham lays Isaac out on the stone and begins binding his hand, the Midrash teaches us that Isaac tells his father to bind him even more tightly so he won't flinch when the knife comes down. Our rabbis come to explain that the legacy we inherit from Isaac is certainly not one of family dysfunction, but of loving devotion to God, because we know that our God is a God of compassion. Additionally, when we consider the other biblical stories, we learn that Jews are the inheritors of a legacy of faith, of justice, of kindness, and of self-sacrifice. My mother-in-law, Carol, of blessed memory, grew up a Jewish Detroiter. Her uncle, Sam Crone, is a past president of this synagogue. Carol and my father-in-law, Jim, moved from Detroit to Michigan's Upper Peninsula before my wife Rebecca was born, and raised her, I'm sure like all of you, on a sheep farm as a Jewish youper. Carol, my mother-in-law, passed away in April of 2007. She bequeathed to me in her will her rabbi son-in-law, her collection of Jewish books, probably no big surprise, and her hunting rifle. Well, I was not expecting either as part of an inheritance. I intuitively know that Carol was planning more than just to laugh in heaven at her rabbi's son-in-law from Troy, Michigan, who hates bugs and dirt, but now owns a hunting rifle. I know she was also telling me that sometimes it's okay to go outside of your comfort zone. It's good to try new things, and also to be careful before you judge others. That is her legacy to me. Exactly 1 month after my mother-in-law Carol died, our first child, Caleb, was born. Carol bequeathed her name, Carol, or in Hebrew, Kayla, to Caleb. And through the memories we share and how we live our lives, my mother-in-law left both my children as well as her grandchildren a very clear legacy of inner strength, of passion for learning, of commitment to Judaism, and a fierce loyalty to Israel. We can bequeath book collections, hunting rifles, and even names. But our legacy is the gift that truly lasts through the years. On Rosh Hashanah, when we struggle with the most complicated of Torah texts, the binding of Isaac, we're called upon to consider the true inheritance we're leaving behind for our children and grandkids, or if we don't have kids of our own, to our friends and family. We ought to consider the true inheritance we're leaving behind. Not a financial gift, but a legacy of learned values and behaviors. Your children, your friends, or your community may or may not know how much they will receive in your will, but they ought to know the legacy you want left behind. And if you asked your heirs today what legacy you were leaving them, would they be able to answer that question? How would you define your legacy? We spend much time, energy, and money securing the next generation's financial future. We must also consider the legacy we're leaving behind. She relates a story in which the Kaiser asks Bismarck, "Can you please exist of God?" Bismarck replies, "The Jews, Your Majesty, the Jews." First and foremost, the Jewish legacy is of faith in the one God. But part and parcel to that notion is the very idea that humanity exists beyond its ability to serve one another. A person's value exceeds what he can do for another person. That is to say, we and the entire world learn from Judaism that each person has intrinsic worth because he or she is created in the divine image. As such, no one is better than another, and all of God's children deserve to live with dignity and respect. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. In addition to leaving the world a legacy of monotheism and of care for our fellow human beings, the legacy our ancestors leave us is one of pursuing justice, of wrestling with God, of commitment to peoplehood, and of practicing kindness and self-sacrifice. This is the legacy we Jews have inherited, which we as a people must pass on to future generations and to the world. And individually, each of us has our own legacy to share as well. What legacy will you leave behind? In this new year, 5776, may God bless us each with health and joy, as well as the determination to articulate for future generations a continued legacy of wisdom, compassion, faith, wrestling, kindness, self-sacrifice, and a commitment to peoplehood. This is a Jewish legacy we inherited from our parents, and a legacy obligated to have future generations. May we in the coming year be blessed also with the strength to live out the personal, individual legacy we hope to leave behind as well. On this Rosh Hashanah 5776, we ask, what is your legacy? Ken Yehi Ratzon, may all of this be God's will. And let us say together, Amen.